Hello. Welcome back to my channel. My name is Ines. This is where we safely feel feels and talk about spirituality. I'm going to talk about my experience with Syria, especially with Ukraine and Russia kind of going on right now. Okay, so my experience with Syria around 2011 to 2013. It was a hard time. Okay, Diaries of a War Child, part 3. Part 2 is supposed to be how war is always for profit. That was a lesson I learned in marketing. My teacher did not realize that I was a war child or that people in his class had first-hand experience going through a war. And so when he said that, it honestly broke my heart in so many different ways. And that is something that is very sensitive. So it deserves the right amount of evidence. And that is an episode that I am taking my time on because it deserves the patience and the time. There's a lot of information I've been collecting from a lot of different creators. And this is something that's been very difficult for me to actually look into just because it drains my energy. And right now, it's not something I want to put my energy towards. So it's really awesome seeing a bunch of other creators start talking about this. So I'm going to be collecting, I think what's going to end up happening is I'm going to be collecting a ton of different content from them, and then putting all that together in a video. I think that way it'll also be a really good way to show people from different points of view, not just my own. And that will allow you guys to see how insane war actually is. And I do have to say, I get really annoyed by people who have opinions on wars when they've never actually been in one. So I know there's a lot of people talking about how the war in Ukraine and Russia is all planned, it's all fake, blah, blah, blah. And this is the thing I want to mention. It might be planned. It was probably planned years ago. It was probably invested into by a ton of different people, oligarchs, leaders, whatever you want to call them, because war is always for profit. However, that does not mean that there are no people dying. There are still very much people dying. War is always planned, 100%, but there are still people dying. So you need to honor and respect the human experience. We're going to talk more about that in another episode that I have notes for here that I'm not recording yet, and it's about respecting the human experience. Okay, so specifically when it comes to Syria, so point of view, I am, oh God, I don't even know how old I was, like 22, 23? I'm not gonna do the math. It was started around 2011. It was one of my last semester of marketing. It was where I learned that war is always for profit. It broke my heart in so many pieces. It added on to the anger I held onto from my own inner child traumas of being a war child. And it made me very angry. And then I moved almost like immediately after, within a few weeks, maybe like 2-3 months, I moved to Toronto, where I was an allocation specialist, and I was basically in charge of working with the factories overseas. I was a buyer. I worked in the buying department for a fashion company, and it was my job to organize and arrange product, shipping it here and shipping it to the stores so that we can make the most amount of profit. And that was honestly a really fun part of my job. And then I ended up moving into assistant buying, which I only did for I think like 5 months before I fully left the entire company and I moved back to Ottawa. Those 2 years were insane, like actually insane. I think I lived like 4 different lives in those 2 years. So what happened was Syria started, which triggered my inner child issues, and it sent me, especially having learned that war is for profit and seeing war on Facebook in my hands, on my computer, on my cell phone, it broke my heart. It was breaking my heart in so many pieces. The thing that was also really hard was the fact that nobody else was caring to witness. Nobody else was caring enough to be like, oh my God, what's happening in Syria, blah, blah, blah. All they said was, well, that doesn't concern us. Well, that's happening over there. It's not happening here. And that broke my heart because they were saying that about me when I was going through the war as a child. And it really made me see how little people cared about others, about human life, and just about how we're supposed to be living. And that in itself broke my heart again. So between the PTSD coming up from my inner child traumas, the shadow side of me of having held in so many emotions, my shadows were literally like demons turning me inside out, and I was going through internal turmoil. And then on top of that, my depression was peaking, my anxiety was peaking, and I held on together through anger. I was so angry. I feel like if I talk to any of my coworkers, any of my peers at that time, I feel like they would say your anger was a major issue. My aggression, my attitude towards people, I was very blunt and honest. I mean, I always am, but I think with the anger and the disappointment I had in humans was just on another level. On top of that, I was having dreams of stuff happening in Syria, and it was making me relive my own experience. The thing that annoys me with this whole Ukraine-Russia thing, and people are calling it out, which I'm so happy about, is the fact that they're acting like this war in Ukraine is like, oh my God, this isn't supposed to happen, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, there's like 20 other wars going on in the world right now. And one thing I really appreciate about what Zelensky did was tell US to step back. I honestly feel like Russia and the States planned this. It was their way of coming out of the COVID recession, if you will. And to them, it was sell some weapons, start a war, get the economy boosted back up. When it comes to war, they don't care about the civilians. They'll always concentrate more. And when I was trying to heal my inner child PTSD, one thing I realized is there is so much support for the families of soldiers and soldiers themselves, but never anything for the actual civilians that had no choice but to go through this, where it wasn't, they didn't want to do this, they didn't want to be a part of this, they didn't want this war to exist. And they're somehow the ones, we're somehow the ones that get stuck with the least attention, yet the most trauma. So one of the reasons why I wanted to start my YouTube was to help other war children. And this is why I never blame my parents for the way that I was raised, because I remember the stress of my parents. I remember how much faith and how much of their soul they lost trying to raise two little girls through an insane amount of violence. And on top of that, my dad's Serbian, my mom's Bosnian. So being in Serbia and hearing the hate towards my mom and hearing the hate from Bosnia towards my dad, it made me realize how hateful people really are. And I had to experience that all over again during Syria. The fact that people don't care about what happens in the rest of the world just goes to show how they choose to be ignorant and blind to what actually happens in the world. And this is where capitalism, colonization, programming thrives. Because when you don't pay attention to the stuff that's happening in the rest of the world, you can't ever change it. And if we choose to be ignorant, because ignorance is bliss, if we choose to continue being ignorant, then that's where that evil thrives and it grows and it becomes more and more powerful. Now that a lot of people are talking about the injustices that are happening all over the world, we are actually capable of having more change than we have ever before. And thankfully, social media is a big reason for that. Obviously, all of us witnessing Ukraine and Russia, and the way that people are taking sides is allowing us to see the truth in people. When it comes to taking sides, I never take the sides of leaders because I know what war stems from. I always side with the civilians that don't want war, that get stuck in it anyways. And they're the ones, like I said, that end up having the least support and the most trauma.